You are still alive. Most people are so ungrateful to be alive. But not you.
Hello. I'd like to play a game with you. Up until now, you just sat there as a voyeur watching other people. Hello. Do you want to play a game? Hello. Do you want to play a game?
Every Saw movie ranked including Jigsaw. Let's look back on the history of one of horror's biggest box office hits. In an alternate universe, the Saw franchise just got new blood with the release of the Chris Rock starring Sparrow. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 shutdown means that the film has been delayed until May 2021, but we can still revisit and rank the existing Saw movies, right? If Saw has always cannibalized itself, it's also made the effort to respect the audience's investment in the mythology, trusting fans to keep up without explaining every reference and continuing to bring back key players in fun and exciting ways, with much more consistency than you can usually expect from a cast in a horror sequel. Whether you like the final product or not, there's no denying that Saw was one of the most vital, brazen entries in the horror genre in ages, one that helped define the genre for a generation. Trying to rank the Saw films is a bit more difficult than you might imagine, not just because they're often too similar, the overlapping plots, timelines, bleeding into one another in a standstill narrative, but because almost all of them are uneven. Some of them have great characters but terrible traps. Sometimes the characters are boring, but the mythology is clever. Almost every film has something interesting to offer, but almost none of them check all the boxes. And now, without further ado, check out all 8 Saw movies ranked below. Number 8, Saw the Final Chapter. Game Over, Saw 3D, or Saw the Final Chapter, or Saw VII, whatever title you slap on the incredibly unpleasant 7th film, it was bad enough to slam the door shut on the franchise for 7 whole years. Despite being by far the most expensive Saw film to produce, Saw 3D looks garish and cheap to the point of distraction. Some of that is due to the unfortunate play toward the 3D trend, which dictated flat and off-putting shot formats geared at flinging viscera toward the camera, but there as a whole, there's a sense of shoddy craftsmanship to the film, from the weird bright pink blood to the thoughtless use of franchise iconography. If the game is bad, the apprentice mythology is worse. It's all about Detective Throatstab Hoffman, who's basically the Terminator at this point. Sure, it's fun to see Dr. Gordon back at last, but fans had speculated about that reveal for years online, making for a full-on case of too little too late. James Bond was clever enough to know that imagining the reverse bear trap was infinitely scarier than seeing it happen, and Saw 3D is the goofy kind of movie that thinks constantly caters to the lowest common denominator. Number 7, Jigsaw. What a wasted opportunity. Love 'em or hate 'em, the Saw films have always been a box office beast, inspiring audiences to pack butts in the theaters. These films have a devoted contingent of fans worldwide, fans who bought into and kept track of the franchise's serialized overlapping narrative for 7 films, with Jigsaw size returning to theaters for the first time in 7 years, and the film could have played to that well-invested mythology or have left it behind in favor of something inventive. Instead, Jigsaw does neither. Number 6, Saw 4. Saw 4 isn't the nadir of the franchise, but it's certainly not a high point. After killing off Jigsaw in Saw 3, new screenwriters Patrick Milton and Marcus Dunstan would see the franchise through Saw 3D, and returning director Darren Lynn Bousman, in his final contribution to the franchise, had to find a way forward without their maniacal mastermind in true Saw tradition. Moving forward meant looking back and piling on all the twists you can handle. Saw 4 dives deep into the history of John Kramer and the origins of his murderous mission to teach the value of life, overcomplicating his origin story to the point of ridiculousness, a point that would somehow get even more absurd as subsequent films as they continue to overlap characters' backstories at unnecessary manufactured intersections. At the same time, the game element of Saw 4 is particularly egregious. Some of the victims are so evil they're pretty much they're just desserts, and the ones you're supposed to be rooting for aren't that likable either. The central character is a bore. The traps are forgettable, and Boseman generally seems to have very little juice left in the tank on his third round. The saving grace for Saw 4 is the clever ending, a move that redefined the structure of the franchise and allowed Jigsaw to remain a player even after his death. Number 5, Saw 3. James Van Vanel and Darren Lane Bousman worked together to connect the story of Saw 3, and the end result is one of the most divisive films in the franchise. For some, Saw 3 is one of the best, if not the best installment. For me, however, it is too cruel by far and marked the turning point when the franchise became more about clever flashbacks and even clever bloodbath and taking and anything else. Saw 3 is where the narrative really starts to stack up, and in that regard, the relationship between John and Amanda is probably the most satisfying emotional core one of these movies have ever had. It's just a shame the movie around it isn't worth watching. Too sadistic by far, with some of the most brutally painful traps in franchise history. Saw 3 is the film that finally earned Saw's reputation as sick and silly gorefest. Number 4, Saw 5. Unpopular opinion, but all these years later, Saw 5 has proven to be one of the most watchable, entertaining films in the franchise. Part of it is the cast, filled it with more recognizable actors than usual, who go a long way toward making their characters memorable in Saw's cavalcade of corpses. But this is also one of the few entries where the Jigsaw's game and his web of apprentices are equally engaging. Outside the game, Detective Hoffman and Detective Strom are locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Strom earns himself a Badass Hall of Fame when he survives an impossible game and comes hot on Hoffman's heels, the rare officer in the Saw series who's actually worth his salt. The final standoff between the two provides one of the most cynical endings in the franchise built on surprise endings. Number 3, Saw 6. After editing the first 5 Saw films, Kevin Greutert made his directorial debut on Saw 6, with Saw 5 screenwriters Patrick Milton and Marcus Dunstan returning to pen the script. The result is one of the more thoughtful and surprising entries in the franchise, with a genuinely surprising ending that, in a refreshing change of pace, didn't hinge on the timeline and retroactive rule changes. Saw 6 is by far the most political film in the franchise, extending Jigsaw's morality test to the world of cutthroat, corporate insurance, and the gatekeepers who use algorithms and bottom lines to determine the value of life. Saw 6 thrives because of its game, but unfortunately this is also where the franchise starts to lose its footing with the twisted mythology of Jigsaw's apprentices, spending far too much time with the one-note detective Hoffman and inefficient officers on his trail. 3 films out from John Kramer's death, there's only so much you can do with the looping timelines and Jigsaw's post-mortem planning. Even with the petering mythology, Saw 6 remains one of the most watchable and entertaining films in the franchise. Number 2, Saw 2. Saw 2 has the distinct feeling of a franchise still finding its footing, not yet settled into a formulaic rut. The sequel went bigger and bloodier, trading terrifying teases for explicit gore and upping the stakes from a two-person game to a group descent into hell when 8 criminals, including the return of Shawnee Smith's Amanda, wake up in an abandoned house that's been transformed into a giant death trap, poisoned and on the hunt for the antidotes hidden around the house. Jigsaw's targets turn on each other, often inflicting more damage than the traps themselves. Darren Lynn Bousman made his franchise debut with Saw 2, working from his original script, which was repurposed as a Saw sequel after Leigh Whannell returned to do some rewrites. The sequel offered the clever and genuinely surprising introduction of Jigsaw's apprentices, but with John Kramer still alive and in the game, the mythology building and timeline stacking hadn't yet overpowered the appeal of Saw's core concept. Saw 2 reinforced the elements of the first film that would become tradition while pushing the franchise in a new direction. And while it's not as vital or innovative as the original, the sequel also has an enormous fingerprint on the legacy of Saw. Plus, that Pit of Needles trap is an all-timer. Number 1, Saw the First. If there's one thing almost everyone can agree on when it comes to the Saw films, it's that James Van's original is the best. It's also significantly different from the string of blood-soaked torture porn sequels it inspired. Made for a scrappy budget, just over $1 million, Van and screenwriter Leigh Whannell's feature film debut is incredibly lean compared to the opulent sequels. Limited by budget and means, Van and Whannell constructed a violence-fueled chamber drama with hints of a neo-noir crime thriller. Jigsaw's torture devices and traps, his so-called games make for terrifying brutality. The acts of violence themselves are largely off-screen, relying on the audience's imagination to fill in the worst. And Saw certainly captured imaginations. The film debuted at Sundance in 2004 and quickly earned hype as an extreme, twisted, and entirely original horror film. Lionsgate ditched their plans to release the film direct to video, and the box office phenomenon was born. It didn't just spawn its own success. It altered the entire horror genre where the so-called torture porn cottage industry is sprouting around Saw's success. Even within the limited scope of the Saw franchise itself, it's incredible how much of Van's fresh from film school's aesthetic and Whannell's narrative truth path have remained touchstones for the franchise all these years later. Not just the torture traps, frantic editing, and iconic creepy visuals looking at you, Billy, but the fundamental structure, victims of the game on the inside, detectives racing to solve the case on the outside, and the time-skipping, interweaving narrative that tees up to a major third-act surprise. Saw engaged the dark fantasy in the audience. How much blood would you shed to stay alive? That simple hook, Van's flourish of crude style, and true innovation, Saw earns its spot in horror history.